The neighborhood kids had noticed the changes too. Where they once ran away when police cars approached, they now waved and called officers by name. The police department's junior cadet program had a waiting list, with young people eager to learn about community-oriented law enforcement. One afternoon, Mrs. Chen sat in on a community police advisory board meeting. The room was filled with a diverse group of residents and officers, all working together on plans for the upcoming months. They weren't just talking about crime prevention, they were discussing after-school programs, job training initiatives, and support for elderly residents. "Look at this," Officer Rivera whispered to her, showing a text message from another department requesting their training materials. "What happened here is spreading. Other communities want what we've built." Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering the tension and fear of that day 6 months ago. "Sometimes," she said, "it takes a moment of crisis to create an opportunity for real change." As the sun set on another day in the transformed community, residents and officers gathered for their weekly community dinner in the park. Children played safely while their parents chatted with patrol officers. Senior citizens taught rookie officers about the neighborhood's history. The line between police and community had blurred into something new and better. "You know what the best part is?" Mrs. Rodriguez said, watching the scene. "This isn't just a program or a policy, this is who we are now." Mrs. Chen nodded, taking in the scene of genuine community she'd helped create. The incident that could have divided them had instead brought them together, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to the brightest changes. What had started as a confrontation on her front porch had grown into a movement that was changing not just one neighborhood or one police department, but the very idea of what community policing could be. 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon on Oak Street. The neighborhood had changed, but not in ways that were immediately visible to outsiders. The real changes were in the small, daily interactions that made up community life. On this particular morning, Mrs. Chen sat on her front porch, sipping tea and watching Officer Wilson help Mrs. Rodriguez with her weekly grocery delivery. It had become a routine. He'd stop by during his break, carrying the heavy bags and checking in on the elderly residents. Today, he was teaching her grandson about the proper way to help seniors safely cross the street. "You know," Mrs. Rodriguez said, joining Mrs. Chen on the porch, "I never thought I'd say this, but having police officers around actually makes me feel safer now. Not because they're police, but because they're part of our community." The local police department had become a model for others across the country. Police chiefs and community leaders from different cities regularly visited to observe their new training programs and community engagement initiatives. The changes that had started with one incident had sparked a movement. At the newly established Community Safety Center, which had replaced the old police substation, Officer Rivera was leading a morning briefing. The room looked different from traditional police briefings. Community members sat alongside officers, participating in daily planning and decision-making. "Yesterday's neighborhood festival was a huge success," Officer Rivera announced, showing pictures on the big screen. "We had over 500 residents attend, and not a single incident required police intervention. That's what community policing looks like." The center's walls were covered with photos from various events: police officers playing basketball with local kids, community cooking classes where residents taught officers their family recipes, and joint training sessions where officers and residents learned from each other. Chief Thompson, who had once been skeptical of such dramatic changes, now regularly gave presentations about their transformation. 6 months ago, we were a department in crisis, he told a group of visiting officials. Today, we're proof that police departments can change, but only if they're willing to truly become part of the community they serve. The numbers backed up his words. Complaints against officers had dropped by 85%. Response times had improved because residents were more willing to work with the police. Even crime rates had decreased, not through aggressive enforcement, but through better community relationships and preventive measures. Back in the neighborhood, Mr. Patel's store had become an unofficial community hub. Officers regularly stopped by during their shifts, not to check for trouble, but to chat with customers and share updates about community programs. Today, he was hosting a cooking demonstration where residents taught officers how to make traditional dishes from different cultures. "Food brings people together," Mr. Patel explained to a visiting reporter. "When you share a meal with someone, you share stories, you share lives. It's hard to be afraid of someone when you've cooked together. The changes weren't just local anymore. Mrs. Chen's phone rang constantly with calls from other retired law enforcement officials asking for advice on implementing similar programs in their cities. She'd started a consulting group that helped police departments rebuild their relationships with their communities. The key, she explained during a national conference call, is understanding that real change isn't about new rules or policies. It's about changing the entire culture of policing. It's about turning us versus them into just us. Officer Wilson had become an unexpected ambassador for change. His story, from being the officer who'd made a terrible mistake to becoming a leader in community policing, resonated with other officers struggling to adapt to new approaches. I used to think being a good police officer meant being tough, being in control, he told a group of police cadets. Now I know it means being part of the community, understanding people's stories, and helping solve problems before they become crimes. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as more people shared their stories. A teenager described how an officer had helped him with his homework at the new community center. An elderly man talked about feeling safer walking in his neighborhood, knowing the officers by name. Finally, the board turned to their decision regarding Officer Wilson. The room grew quiet as the chairperson stood. Officer Wilson, based on your actions during the incident, you could face severe disciplinary action, including termination. Wilson nodded, accepting this possibility. However, your response to this incident, your willingness to learn, change, and help others learn from your mistakes, has demonstrated the kind of growth we hope to see in all our officers. The board's decision was balanced. Wilson would return to active duty, but with ongoing oversight. He would continue working with the community training program, sharing his experience to help other officers avoid similar mistakes. Most importantly, he would be part of the department's new mentoring program for rookie officers. As the hearing concluded, people didn't rush to leave. Instead, they gathered in small groups, talking about next steps and future plans. Mrs. Chen watched as Officer Wilson spoke quietly with Mrs. Rodriguez, probably arranging his next volunteer shift at the community center. Outside, the evening was settling in, but the police station parking lot was full of people chatting, sharing snacks, and making plans for upcoming community events. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into connection. "You know," Officer Rivera said, joining Mrs. Chen as she prepared to leave, "other departments are starting to notice what we're doing here. We've had requests from 3 other cities to share our new training programs." Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering her early days at the FBI when change seemed impossible. "That's how progress happens," she said, watching the mixed crowd of officers and community members. One department, one officer, one community at a time. 1 month had passed since the incident, and the police department's main conference room was packed for the public hearing. The walls, once bare and institutional, now displayed colorful posters about community policing and photographs from recent neighborhood events. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her notebook open as always, watching as Officer Wilson faced the community oversight board. This wasn't a typical disciplinary hearing. Instead of just focusing on punishment, it was designed as a platform for accountability and growth. The room was filled with faces both familiar and new community members, fellow officers, and even reporters who had been following the story. "Officer Wilson," the board chairperson began, "would you like to address the community?" Wilson stood up, looking different from the angry officer of a month ago. His posture was more open, his expression humbler. "First, I want to apologize," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "Not just for my actions that day, but for all the times I let my biases and frustrations affect my judgment." He turned to face the audience directly. "This past month has been the hardest and most important of my career. I've had to face some ugly truths about myself and my approach to policing. But I've also learned that it's possible to change, to do better." Mrs. Chen watched with quiet satisfaction as Wilson detailed the steps he'd taken, the counseling sessions, the additional training, the community service hours he'd volunteered even while on administrative leave. He wasn't just checking boxes, he was genuinely working to transform himself. "Last weekend," Wilson continued, "I helped at Mr. Patel's store, unloading deliveries, the same kind of activity I once viewed with suspicion. And you know what? I learned more about our community in those few hours than I had in months of patrolling. The hearing continued with community members sharing their perspectives. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about the changes she'd seen in police interactions in her neighborhood. Mr. Patel described how officers now regularly stopped by his store just to chat with customers. Officer Rivera presented data from the past month. Complaints were down, community engagement was up, and officer morale had actually improved with the new training and support systems in place. This isn't just about one incident anymore, she explained, showing charts and graphs. We're seeing a complete shift in how our officers approach their work. They're spending more time getting to know the community and less time responding to confrontations, because they're preventing those confrontations from happening in the first place. Chief Thompson stood up next, addressing both the board and the community. A month ago, I saw this situation as a potential disaster for our department. Today, I see it as the wake-up call we needed. He gestured to the new community engagement programs displayed on the walls. These changes aren't just window dressing. They're fundamental shifts in how we serve our community. The board members listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. This wasn't about quick fixes or punitive measures, it was about ensuring lasting change. Mrs. Chen was called to speak next. She stood slowly, carrying with her the weight of 30 years of law enforcement experience. When this incident happened, she began, I had a choice. I could have pushed for punishment, filed lawsuits, demanded resignations. Instead, I chose to push for transformation. She walked to the front of the room, her small frame commanding attention. I've seen departments across the country face similar moments. Too often, they react with defensive measures and superficial changes. But here, something different happened. This department, under Chief Thompson's leadership and with Officer Wilson's courage to change, chose to do the hard work of real reform. The afternoon session focused on practical changes. New protocols were being implemented for responding to calls, with emphasis on gathering information before taking action. Officers would work in pairs more often, providing backup and different perspectives on situations. We're also changing how we handle complaints, Officer Rivera explained to the group. Every complaint will be reviewed by both internal affairs and a community oversight board. No more brushing things under the rug. The news media was still interested in the story, but the narrative had shifted. Instead of focusing on the incident, they were now covering the innovative changes being implemented. Other police departments had started calling, asking about the training program. As the day wound down, Mrs. Chen gathered everyone for a final discussion. The room was filled with tired but engaged faces, officers, community members, and training staff who had spent the day working toward real change. What we're doing here isn't easy, she acknowledged. We're asking everyone to question their assumptions, change their habits, and trust each other. But look around this room. A week ago, many of us were on opposite sides. Today, we're working together. Officer Wilson raised his hand. Mrs. Chen, I've been thinking. Once I'm back on duty, I'd like to start a mentoring program for new officers. Help them avoid the mistakes I made. The suggestion was met with approving nods. This was how real change happened, not through force or fear, but through understanding and commitment to do better. As people began packing up for the day, Mrs. Chen noticed something remarkable. Officers and community members were exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet again, building the kind of relationships that would prevent future incidents. This is just the beginning, she told Officer Rivera as they watched people leaving. The real test will come in the daily interactions, the small moments when no one's watching. But that's what makes it real, Officer Rivera replied. We're not just changing policies, we're changing hearts and minds. Outside, the sun was setting on another day of progress. The incident that could have torn the community apart was instead bringing it together, proving that even the most difficult moments could lead to positive change. 1 week after the incident, the community center buzzed with activity. The large meeting hall had been transformed into a temporary police training facility, with officers sitting alongside community members. At the front of the room, Mrs. Chen stood next to a projection screen, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. Today, we're going to look at real situations and discuss better approaches, she announced, clicking to the first slide. And yes, we're going to start with my own incident. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Chen smiled reassuringly. We learn best from real examples, even when they're difficult to watch. Officer Wilson sat in the front row, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes during his administrative leave. The past week had changed him. After spending days reviewing his past actions and talking with a department psychologist, he'd volunteered to be part of the training program, as an example of how unconscious bias could affect decision-making. "I'd like to share something," he said, standing up. His voice trembled slightly, but he continued. "Looking back at that day, I can see how everything I did was wrong. I went in assuming the worst, seeing threats that weren't there." He paused, looking around the room. "But what scares me most is that I thought I was doing my job right." Mrs. Chen nodded encouragingly. "That's exactly what we need to address. It's not just about changing actions, it's about changing the thinking that leads to those actions." In another corner of the room, Officer Rivera was working with a group of community volunteers, including Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Patel. They were developing a new neighborhood liaison program where officers would regularly meet with residents in casual settings. "The coffee shop meetings are really popular," Officer Rivera reported, showing their progress charts. "Last weekend, we had 30 people show up to talk with officers over breakfast. Real conversations, real connections." The changes weren't just happening in training rooms. Down at the police station, the Internal Affairs Office had been completely reorganized. Complaint files that had been gathering dust were being reviewed by a joint team of police officials and community representatives. The new transparency was uncomfortable for some, but necessary for real change. Chief Thompson had surprised everyone with his commitment to the reforms. After the initial shock wore off, he'd thrown himself into the change process. Today, he was in his office, meeting with city officials to secure funding for body camera upgrades and additional training resources. "Look at these statistics," he said, spreading papers across his desk. "Just in the past week, we've seen a 30% decrease in confrontational incidents. Our officers are taking more time to assess situations, asking more questions before acting." Back at the community center, Mrs. Chen was demonstrating de-escalation techniques. She'd brought in professional actors to create realistic scenarios, and officers took turns practicing different approaches. The focus wasn't on what they did wrong, but on how they could do better. "Remember," she called out during one exercise, "your first goal is to understand the situation. Every person you encounter has a story, a reason for their actions. Your job is to learn that story before making judgments." During the lunch break, officers and community members shared meals together, talking about their lives and experiences. Mr. Patel had brought food from his store, and the atmosphere was more like a family gathering than a training session. "You know what's different about this program?" one veteran officer commented, helping himself to some samosas. "It's not just about following rules. It's about understanding why the rules exist." Mrs. Chen overheard and smiled. That was exactly what she'd hoped for, not just compliance, but comprehension. She watched as Officer Wilson sat down with Mrs. Rodriguez, the two of them talking quietly over their lunch. Healing happened in small moments like these. As they spoke, Officer Wilson was in another room with internal affairs investigators. The brash confidence from yesterday was gone, replaced by genuine remorse as he watched the videos of his behavior. I didn't realize how it looked," he kept saying. "I need help." That admission would prove to be a turning point. Mrs. Chen had always believed that real change started with acknowledgement of the problem. When she heard about Wilson's statement, she made a note to include him in the reform process, not as a villain, but as an example of how bias and poor training could affect even well-intentioned officers. By late afternoon, the conference room walls were covered with charts, timelines, and action plans. Officers would undergo new training programs, community oversight committees would be established, and a transparent complaint investigation process would be implemented. Mrs. Chen stood at the window, watching as more community members gathered outside the station. Some held signs calling for change, but unlike typical protests, many were also offering to help, to serve on committees, to participate in training scenarios, to bridge the gap between police and community. "You know," Officer Rivera said, joining her at the window, "when I joined the force, this is what I hope to be part of. Real change, not just enforcing laws." Mrs. Chen smiled. "That's exactly the attitude we need. Law enforcement isn't about power over people, it's about serving and protecting them. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call to remind us of that." As the sun began to set on the second day, Mrs. Chen gathered everyone for a final meeting. The room was tired but energized, filled with people who had spent the day planning real, concrete changes. Tomorrow, the hard work of implementation would begin, but tonight, there was hope. Remember, Mrs. Chen said, closing her notebook, what happened yesterday wasn't just about one officer and one incident. It was about patterns and systems that need to change. And change starts with each person in this room committing to do better, to be better, and to demand better. The next morning, the story had exploded across national news networks. Video clips of the incident were playing on every major channel, and #retired FBI neighbor was trending on social media. Mrs. Chen's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, but she remained focused on what really mattered, making real change happen. The police station's largest conference room was packed by 9 a.m. Mrs. Chen sat at the head of the table, her notebook open and reading glasses perched on her nose. Around her sat Chief Thompson, several internal affairs investigators, representatives from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and Officer Rivera, who had been appointed as the department's new community relations liaison. Let's look at Officer Wilson's record, Mrs. Chen said, opening a thick folder. The room grew quiet. In the past 3 months since his transfer here, there have been 6 complaints about excessive force and inappropriate conduct. All of them were dismissed without proper investigation. Chief Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Our internal review process is broken, Mrs. Chen finished firmly. And that's where we'll start. Officer Rivera, would you share what you found in your preliminary investigation? Officer Rivera stood up, her confidence growing with each passing hour. We discovered that Officer Wilson's body camera has been reported as malfunctioning during several previous incidents. Also, his transfer from his previous department came after similar complaints, but those records were never properly reviewed. The FBI representatives exchanged knowing looks. One of them, Agent Lee, spoke up. This is unfortunately a common pattern. Officers with problematic records get transferred between departments instead of being properly disciplined or retrained. Mrs. Chen nodded, which is exactly why this case is going to be different. She pulled out another folder. I've drafted a proposal for a new department-wide training program. It includes de-escalation techniques, bias recognition, and community engagement protocols. But more importantly, it includes a complete overhaul of the complaint investigation process. Outside the conference room, the station was buzzing with activity. News crews had set up camp in the parking lot, and community members were arriving with letters and stories of their own experiences. The incident had opened a floodgate of long-suppressed concerns. Back in the meeting, Mrs. Chen was displaying surveillance footage from nearby houses that had captured the incident. Look at Officer Wilson's body language here, she pointed. The aggressive approach, the immediate escalation, these are clear signs of poor training and personal bias affecting judgment. Officer Rivera raised her hand. Mrs. Chen, I've been going through our training materials. They haven't been updated in over a decade. Most of our officers haven't had any de-escalation training since the academy. Exactly, Mrs. Chen smiled. Which is why I called in some help. She gestured to a group of people entering the room. Police training experts, civil rights attorneys, and community leaders. These professionals have agreed to help us rebuild your training program from the ground up. The day continued with intense discussions and planning. Mrs. Chen moved through it all with the precision and attention to detail that had made her legendary at the FBI. She wasn't just addressing one incident, she was helping to rebuild an entire department's culture. During a short break, Chief Thompson pulled Mrs. Chen aside. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, he began, looking more tired than ever. About this being an opportunity rather than a scandal. You were right. We've been resistant to change for too long. Mrs. Chen patted his arm sympathetically. Change is never easy, Chief, but it's necessary. You know what I learned in 30 years at the Bureau? The hardest changes often lead to the most important improvements. Well, Officer Rivera, I think you're about to get all the support you need. Mrs. Chen turned back to Chief Thompson. Chief, I spent 30 years watching departments resist change until something big forced their hand. This could be that moment for your department, but it's up to you whether it's a scandal or an opportunity for improvement. The chief was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. The media presence was growing, and he could already imagine tomorrow's headlines. Finally, he nodded. "What do you suggest?" Mrs. Chen opened her notebook. "First, we need to address immediate issues. Officer Wilson's body camera was off, which violates department policy. Second, the response to a suspicious person call showed clear bias in threat assessment. Third, the use of force was completely unnecessary and violated multiple protocols." She continued methodically, her years of experience evident in every word. "But more importantly, we need to look at the bigger picture. Your department needs updated training programs, better community engagement, and clear accountability measures. I'm willing to help with all of that, but only if you're serious about making real changes." The gathering had taken on the feeling of a historic moment. Neighbors were recording everything, journalists were scribbling notes, and even the other police officers were listening intently. Officer Wilson, still sitting in the police car, watched through the window as his mistake was becoming the catalyst for departmental transformation. Mrs. Rodriguez suddenly stood up. "I'm making coffee for everyone," she announced. "We might be here a while." A few neighbors immediately offered to help, and soon there was a steady stream of people bringing chairs, coffee, and even snacks to the front yard. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Chen's front yard had become an impromptu command center for change. Officer Rivera was taking detailed notes, community members were forming committees, and Chief Thompson was on the phone with City Hall, explaining the situation and the proposed changes. Mrs. Chen watched it all with quiet satisfaction. Sometimes the best way to address injustice wasn't through punishment, but through transformation. She picked up her phone and began making those 3 important calls. The real work was just beginning. Within 30 minutes, the quiet suburban street had transformed into something that looked like a scene from a TV show. Police cars lined the curb, their lights painting the neighborhood in alternating flashes of red and blue. The police chief himself, a tall man with graying hair named Chief Thompson, had arrived after hearing that a retired FBI assistant director was involved. News vans were starting to appear too, drawn by the viral videos that were already spreading across social media like wildfire. Mrs. Chen watched it all unfold from her front porch, where she sat calmly writing down every detail of the incident while it was still fresh in her mind. Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside her, still shaken but refusing to leave her friend's side. "Ma'am," Chief Thompson approached, his face etched with concern, "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today." He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, his posture respectful but uncomfortable. It wasn't every day that a routine call turned into a potential scandal involving a former FBI assistant director. Mrs. Chen looked up from her notes. "Chief Thompson, I appreciate the apology, but I'm more interested in actions than words." She gestured to the notebook in her lap. "I've documented everything that happened here today, including several serious procedural violations that need to be addressed." The chief shifted his weight nervously. Behind him, Officer Wilson sat in the back of a police car, looking pale and shell-shocked. Several internal affairs officers had already arrived and were interviewing neighbors, collecting video evidence from their phones. "We'll launch a full investigation immediately," Chief Thompson assured her. "Officer Wilson will be placed on administrative leave pending." "Chief," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently, "this isn't just about Officer Wilson." She stood up, her small frame somehow commanding the entire scene. "This is about training, procedures, and department culture. What happened today was a symptom of deeper problems." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded firmly beside her. "She's right. I've lived here for 40 years, and I've seen too many incidents like this." Her voice carried the weight of decades of observation, maybe not as dramatic, but the same attitude. More neighbors had gathered around the porch, forming an impromptu community meeting. Mr. Patel from the corner store spoke up. "Last month, one of my delivery drivers was questioned for 20 minutes just for unloading boxes at night. We reported it, but nothing happened." The chief looked increasingly uncomfortable as more residents began sharing similar stories. Mrs. Chen listened carefully, her trained investigator's mind picking up patterns and systemic issues. This was exactly why she never fully retired. There was still too much work to be done. "Here's what's going to happen," Mrs. Chen said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. Everyone fell silent, including the news reporters who had edged closer with their microphones. "I'm going to make 3 calls. The first will be to my former colleagues at the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The second will be to the Police Accountability Task Force that I helped establish before retiring. And the third will be to my old friend who runs the Police Training Academy. She paused, making sure everyone understood the significance of what she was saying. This incident isn't going to be buried in paperwork or dismissed with a suspension. We're going to use it as a catalyst for real change. One of the internal affairs officers, a younger woman with a determined expression, stepped forward. Mrs. Chen, I'd like to be part of that change. I've been trying to push for better training programs, but she glanced nervously at the chief before continuing. It's been difficult to get support. Mrs. Chen smiled warmly at her. What's your name, officer? Officer Rivera, ma'am. Internal Affairs, 3 years. Of neighbors helping neighbors with groceries. Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. Officer, I spent 3 decades training law enforcement officers. Would you like to know what I observed in the last 5 minutes? The crowd leaned in slightly, phones still recording. Even those watching from their windows had opened them to hear better. Officer Wilson swallowed hard, but didn't respond. I observed an officer escalating a non-threatening situation, using excessive force on a compliant citizen, failing to follow proper identification procedures, and most importantly, she paused, making sure her words were clear for all the recordings, failing to recognize that his own prejudices were clouding his judgment. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Someone, probably one of the neighbors, had called for additional officers. Mrs. Chen knew what would happen next. She had been on the other side of similar situations countless times during her career. Your body camera is off, she noted, loud enough for everyone to hear. Fortunately, these concerned citizens have documented everything. Now, would you like to tell me why you felt it necessary to use force on an elderly woman helping her neighbor with groceries? The approaching sirens grew louder, and red and blue lights began to flash against the houses. Officer Wilson's radio crackled with voices asking for his status. He reached for it with a shaking hand, but before he could respond, 3 police cars pulled up to the curb. Mrs. Chen stood calmly, her credentials still visible in her hand. She knew this moment wasn't just about her or Officer Wilson anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced similar treatment without having the protection of a gold shield. It was about systemic changes that needed to happen. As the new officers approached, Mrs. Chen began mentally preparing for what would come next. She wasn't interested in punishment for punishment's sake. No, she had spent too many years in law enforcement to believe that would solve anything. What she wanted, what she had always worked for, was meaningful change. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across Mrs. Rodriguez's scattered groceries. The oranges that had rolled across the lawn now glowed like small suns in the evening light. It seemed fitting somehow, small bright spots of hope in a difficult situation. The next few hours would be crucial, not just for Officer Wilson's career, but for the entire department's future approach to community policing. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Officer Wilson's hand shot forward, grabbing Mrs. Chen's shoulder roughly. The unnecessary force made her stumble backward, but years of FBI training kept her balanced. Several gasps erupted from the growing crowd of neighbors, and the sound of phone cameras clicking filled the air. Stop resisting, Officer Wilson shouted, though Mrs. Chen hadn't moved except to maintain her balance. His face was red with misplaced anger, his judgment clouded by his personal frustrations. He tightened his grip, ignoring Mrs. Rodriguez's pleading voice in the background. Mrs. Chen remained remarkably calm, her experienced mind already documenting every detail of the encounter. She noticed how Officer Wilson's body camera was turned off, how his nameplate was slightly crooked, and how his hands trembled slightly, all signs of an officer who had lost control of both the situation and himself. Officer Wilson, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of law enforcement experience. I am not resisting. I am a resident of this neighborhood, and I was helping my neighbor with her groceries. I have identification that proves this. But Officer Wilson wasn't listening. Instead, he twisted her arm behind her back, using a hold that any trained professional would know was excessive for an unresisting person. The crowd grew larger, and more phones appeared, recording every second of the incident. Mr. Patel, who ran the corner store and had known Mrs. Chen since she moved in, stepped forward. "Officer, please, she lives here. She's a retired federal agent." His voice shook with a mixture of concern and disbelief. That's when everything changed. Officer Wilson's grip loosened slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "Federal agent," he repeated, but his moment of uncertainty quickly turned to defensive anger. "Yeah, right, and I'm the president." Mrs. Chen used this moment to speak again, her voice steady and professional. "Officer Wilson, in my back pocket, you'll find my retired FBI credentials. I spent 30 years with the Bureau, most recently as Assistant Director of the Civil Rights Division. I'm going to suggest you remove your hands from me and take a step back." The authority in her voice made several onlookers nod in appreciation. They had never heard their quiet neighbor speak like this before. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, still worried but now standing straighter, felt a surge of pride for her friend. Officer Wilson's face went through a rapid series of emotions: disbelief, doubt, and then the first flickers of fear as he began to realize the gravity of his mistake. His hands dropped away from Mrs. Chen as if she had suddenly become electrified. Mrs. Chen slowly reached into her back pocket and produced her credentials, the gold FBI shield gleaming in the afternoon sun. She held them up not for Officer Wilson, but for the cameras that were recording everything. Years of experience had taught her the importance of documentation. "Badge number 7845, retired Assistant Director Chen," she announced clearly for the recordings. "Officer Wilson, I'll need your badge number and the name of your supervising officer." Her voice was firm but not unkind. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was following procedure. The gathered crowd had fallen completely silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. Officer Wilson stood frozen, his face pale as the implications of his actions began to sink in. His hand, which had been so quick to grab earlier, now trembled slightly at his side. Mrs. Rodriguez had recovered enough to start picking up her scattered groceries. Two teenage neighbors rushed to help her while keeping their phones recording. The incident was already being uploaded to various social media platforms, where it would soon go viral. I was responding to a suspicious person call," Officer Wilson stammered, his earlier aggression deflating like a punctured balloon. "We had reports of." Mrs. Chen remained perfectly still, her mind racing through possible outcomes. She could see neighbors starting to peek through their windows, some already pulling out their phones to record what was happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had ever faced unjust treatment, about every officer who had forgotten their true duty to protect and serve. "Officer Wilson," she read his nameplate calmly, "I'm going to reach for my ID very slowly. It's in my back pocket." She announced her movements clearly, just as she had trained countless other agents to do during her years at the Bureau. But before she could even move her hand, Officer Wilson made the mistake that would change everything. The air seemed to freeze as his hand shot forward, his face contorted with misplaced anger and fear. The next few seconds would become a turning point not just for Officer Wilson, but for the entire police department. What he didn't know was that his actions were about to trigger a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted issues within the force and lead to changes that would ripple through law enforcement agencies across the country. Behind the growing crowd of onlookers, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, where scattered groceries lay forgotten among the fallen leaves. The simple act of neighborly kindness had unexpectedly become a moment that would test not just one person's character, but the very foundations of justice and accountability in their community. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees on Oak Street as Mrs. Chen, a petite woman in her late 50s, carefully arranged her grocery bags on her front porch. Her silver hair was neatly tied back in a bun, and despite retiring from her prestigious 30-year career at the FBI just months ago, she still carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had earned her respect throughout her career. Living in this peaceful suburban neighborhood was supposed to be her quiet retirement plan. After decades of breaking glass ceilings as one of the few Asian American women in the FBI's top ranks, she had chosen this community for its diverse population and friendly atmosphere. Most of her neighbors knew her simply as the kind lady who shared homemade dumplings during festivals and helped tend to the community garden. That ordinary Tuesday afternoon started like any other. Mrs. Chen had just returned from her weekly grocery run and noticed her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, struggling with her own shopping bags. Without hesitation, she set her bags down and walked over to help. "Let me give you a hand with those," Mrs. Chen called out, her warm smile lighting up her face. She had always believed in community service, whether she was wearing her FBI badge or not. Mrs. Rodriguez gratefully accepted the help, and the two women chatted about the upcoming neighborhood potluck as they carried the bags together. What neither of them noticed was the new patrol car slowly cruising down their street. Officer Wilson, who had transferred to their precinct just 3 months ago, was responding to a vague call about suspicious activity in the area. The caller had mentioned something about unfamiliar people moving things between houses without providing any other details. Officer Wilson had been having a rough day. His supervisor had reprimanded him earlier for being too aggressive during a routine traffic stop, and his personal life wasn't going much better. His wife had left him last month, taking their kids with her, and the stress was clearly affecting his judgment. He'd been looking for an opportunity to prove himself, to show everyone he was still in control. As he watched Mrs. Chen moving between the houses with bags, something in his mind clicked wrong. Instead of seeing two neighbors helping each other, he saw what he wanted to see, a potential crime in progress. He didn't notice the carefully tended garden, the personalized welcome mat, or the family photos visible through Mrs. Chen's front window. He didn't see the community, he only saw a target. The patrol car's tires crunched on the fallen leaves as Officer Wilson pulled up sharply to the curb. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez were just finishing up with the last bag when they heard the car door slam. The sound echoed through the quiet street, making several birds take flight from a nearby tree. "Hey, you there, stop what you're doing and put those bags down." Officer Wilson's voice boomed across the front yard, unnecessarily loud for the peaceful afternoon. His hand was already resting on his belt as he approached, his body language aggressive and threatening. Mrs. Chen straightened up slowly, her years of law enforcement experience immediately kicking in. She recognized the signs of an escalating situation, and her mind automatically started running through de-escalation techniques. She kept her movements deliberate and calm, even as her heart rate picked up, not from fear, but from concern about how this situation might unfold. "Officer, good afternoon," she said clearly, keeping her hands visible. "I'm just helping my neighbor with her groceries. I live right next door." Her voice was steady and professional, drawing from decades of experience in high-pressure situations. But Officer Wilson wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his own narrative, too eager to prove himself. "I said put those bags down. Both of you, hands where I can see them." His voice had taken on that dangerous edge that experienced law enforcement officers know too well, the sound of someone about to make a serious mistake. Mrs. Rodriguez, startled by the sudden aggression, dropped her bag. Oranges spilled across the lawn, rolling in different directions like bright autumn leaves. "Officer, please," she started to say, her voice shaking. "This is my neighbor." "Ma'am, step back." Officer Wilson barked, moving closer to Mrs. Chen. "I've got reports of suspicious activity in this area." His hand was now firmly gripped on his belt, his stance aggressive.